Someone once looked at the world and decided to draw it. You're listening to Made for Sleep, where history unfolds slowly and without urgency. Tonight, we explore what the oldest map on Earth is trying to tell us, not just about rivers and cities, but about how early minds understood the shape of their world. Let the fire settle as the lines of the past come into focus. And if you'd like, let me know how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening from. Before GPS satellites traced our movements and before Mercator grids divided the world into neat rectangles, someone pressed their palm into wet clay and drew lines that meant something. This is the story of humanity's first attempts to capture the world, not as it appeared from above, but as it felt from within, when every river was a story and every mountain held a name you inherited from your grandmother. You wake up in a world without maps, and for a moment, you feel unmoored. Not because you're lost, you know exactly where you are, but because the very concept of where exists differently in your mind than it does in ours. The year is approximately 2500 BCE, and you're sitting near the banks of a river that will one day be called the Euphrates, though that name carries no meaning for you yet. The sun hasn't cleared the reed beds to the east, and the air smells of wet clay and yesterday's cooking fire. Your world exists entirely in memory. When someone asks how to reach the village where your cousin married last summer, you don't envision a route marked in kilometres or degrees. Instead, you remember the way the path feels under your feet, the stretch where loose stones make you watch your step, the place where wild mint grows thick enough to scent your ankles as you pass, and the twisted tamarisk tree where you always stop to rest, because its shade falls just so at midday. These aren't landmarks on a grid. They're characters in a story your body knows by heart. The village elders keep the important knowledge. Old Enlil, named for the storm god but gentle as summer rain, can recite the journey to the obsidian quarries in the Northern Highlands, a trip that takes 13 days if you're young and unburdened, 17 if you're carrying trade goods. But he doesn't describe it the way you might expect. He talks about sleeping 7 times in valleys and 6 times on ridges. He mentions the spring that tastes faintly of iron, the canyon where eagles nest in pairs, and the meadow where your group will need to decide whether to bear left toward the dangerous pass with better water, or right toward the longer route where wild onions grow. You've never seen this journey yourself, but you could make it if you had to. The knowledge lives in the rhythm of his telling, in the way certain details repeat and anchor themselves in your memory. This is what a map looks like when it exists only in breath and attention. This morning, though, something unusual is happening. The reed worker called Namu, a woman whose fingers can coax river reeds into baskets so tight they hold water, has been given a task by the temple administrators. They want her to create something that preserves memory outside of human minds. The concept alone feels strange, almost sacrilegious. Memory belongs in people, passed from mouth to ear, from elder to child, stored in the architecture of stories and songs. But the temple granaries have grown complex. Barley comes from 17 different farming settlements now, each with its own obligations and yields. The administrators struggle to keep track of which community owes what, which fields lie fallow, and where the irrigation ditches need repair. Someone, nobody remembers who first suggested it, proposed making memory visible. Namu needs clay between her palms, the same river clay she uses for her basket forms. You watch her face as she works, noting the small crease between her eyebrows that suggests she's solving a problem that has no clear solution. How do you take something as alive and shifting as the known world and press it flat? How do you trap the story of a place in mud? She starts with what she knows, the river. Using her thumb, she draws a long, wavering depression in the clay tablet. It doesn't look much like the Euphrates, too straight in some places, too curved in others, but you recognize it instantly. Not because it's accurate in any measurable sense, but because she's captured something essential about its character. The way it swells and narrows, the personality of its movement. You lean closer, fascinated. To the east of the river line, she presses small circular depressions. Reed beds, you realise. Not every reed bed that exists, but the ones that matter. The dense growth where basket makers harvest in autumn, the shallow marsh where waterfowl nest, and the treacherous soft ground where an unwary traveller might sink to their knees. These aren't geographic features. They're relationships, warnings, and resources. A small boy named Shulgi wanders over, chewing on a reed stem. He's maybe 6 years old, gap-toothed and sunburned, and he looks at Namu's work with the refreshing honesty of someone too young for politeness. "That's not what the river looks like," he announces. Namu doesn't look up from her work. What does the river look like? Shulgi considers this seriously. Big, wet, brown when it floods, blue when it doesn't. Sometimes it has fish. "Can you show me all of that at once?" Namu asks. The boy frowns, recognizing a trap but unsure where it lies. Finally he shakes his head. "Neither can I," Namu says, not unkindly. "So I show what matters for remembering. This is the birth of cartography, though nobody will use that word for millennia. This is the moment when human beings first tried to capture space in symbol, and the attempt is necessarily imperfect, necessarily interpretive, and necessarily more poetry than precision. Over the next hours, more people gather to watch. Some offer suggestions. Mark where the ferry crosses, note the place where the current runs fast enough to power the grain mill, and show the bend where crocodiles sun themselves on the bank. Each edition reveals what the community values, what they fear, and what they need to remember. The map becomes a document of relationship rather than measurement. You notice something peculiar as the work continues. Nobody bothers to mark the distances between places. When someone suggests adding the temple complex to the clay tablet, they don't debate whether it's the correct scale or properly positioned relative to the river. They simply press a rectangular depression into the clay at a spot that feels right, that preserves the essential truth that the temple sits near the river but on high ground, safe from flooding. An old trader named Namu stops by, leaning heavily on his walking stick. He's travelled more than anyone else in the settlement, venturing south to the salt marshes of the Gulf, and north into the foothills where cedar trees grow. He studies Namu's work with the critical eye of someone who's spent decades converting landscape into memory. "You've forgotten the danger," he says finally. "What danger?" "The wilderness beyond our knowing." He taps his stick on the edge of the tablet beyond the marks Namu has made. "Show them that the world has edges, places where our knowledge fails." Namu considers this, then uses a sharp stick to score rough, irregular lines at the margins of the map. Not a border exactly, but a kind of visual static, a way of indicating that beyond these marks lies territory outside the scope of this memory document. Years from now, scholars will puzzle over these marginal scribbles, trying to interpret them as decorative elements, or symbolic representations of mountains or water, but you understand their true purpose. They're an admission of ignorance, a cartographic way of saying, "Here be mysteries." As the sun climbs higher and the clay begins to dry in the heat, you realise you're witnessing something profound. This tablet won't show the world as it would appear to a bird flying overhead or a god looking down from the heavens. It shows the world as it feels to live in it, to walk its paths, to fear its dangers, and to rely on its gifts. The river isn't drawn to scale because its length matters less than its character. The settlements aren't positioned with mathematical precision because their exact coordinates matter less than understanding their relationships to water, to each other, and to the resources that sustain them. Shulgi, who's been watching in patient silence, patient for a 6-year-old anyway, suddenly asks a question that makes several adults chuckle. "If we make the world small enough to fit in your hands, does that mean we understand it?" Namu sets down her tools and really looks at the boy. "No," she says. "It means we've made a tool for remembering what we know and marking what we don't." The distinction matters. This clay tablet won't replace human memory or human storytelling. It won't eliminate the need for elders who carry knowledge in their bones and breath. Instead, it supplements that knowledge, creating a kind of external memory that can persist even when the person who first walked a path has died. It's a technology of preservation, but also a technology of humility, because every mark pressed into clay is simultaneously a claim of knowledge and an admission of limitation. You stay as Namu works into the afternoon, adding and refining, occasionally scraping away a mark that doesn't feel true to the place it represents. Other people come and go, offering their own memories of the landscape, debating the proper way to represent a seasonal spring that flows only during the wet months, and arguing good-naturedly about whether the hill where wild wheat grows deserves marking. What strikes you most is how collaborative the process becomes. This isn't one person's vision of the world, but a collective memory pressed into physical form. Different hands contribute different knowledge. The shepherd notes where predators den. The herbalist marks where medicinal plants cluster. The builder indicates where a good stone can be quarried. The map accumulates these layers of expertise, becoming a document that no single person could have created alone. As evening approaches and long shadows stretch across the settlement, Namu finally sets the tablet aside to finish drying. It's far from complete. Already people are suggesting additional features, corrections and refinements. But it exists. The world has been captured in clay, not as it is, but as it's known. Not as measurement, but as meaning. You run your fingers along the edge of the tablet, careful not to disturb the still soft clay. The warmth of the day has been absorbed by the material, and it holds heat like the earth itself. Tomorrow, this tablet might be fired in a kiln, hardening into permanence, or it might simply be allowed to dry in the sun until it becomes stone-like and durable. Either way, it represents a threshold crossed, the moment when human beings decided that the world could be not just remembered but shown. That night, sitting around the communal fire, you listen to the usual stories, the ones about ancestors and heroes, about the time the river flooded so high that fish swam through the streets, and about the proper way to read the stars for planting season. But now you hear them differently, aware that these oral maps exist alongside the clay map drying in Namu's workshop. The two forms of knowledge don't compete. They complement each other, like two languages describing the same essential truth from different angles. Before sleep takes you, you think about that question Shulgi asked. Does making the world small enough to hold mean you understand it? The answer, you realise, is both no and yes. No, because the map is always less than the territory, always a reduction, always an interpretation. But yes, because the attempt to map reveals what you know, and, more importantly, what you don't. The edges of knowledge become visible. The gaps in understanding show themselves. And in that revelation lies the possibility of learning, of expanding the map, of pushing back the margins where Namu drew her marks of mystery. You fall asleep to the sound of the river moving in the darkness, its course invisible but known, its presence a constant that predates maps and will outlast them, flowing through a world that existed long before anyone thought to press its memory into clay. Morning arrives with the particular quality of light that suggests autumn is thinking about arriving. Though summer still holds the days in its warm grip, you find yourself in a different place now, a workshop that smells of wet earth and wood smoke, where pigments ground from minerals and plants sit in small clay vessels, arranged by colour like a sunset laid out in bowls. The mapmaker here is called Ninshubur, and their hands tell the story of decades spent working with materials that resist precision. Calluses ridge the palms. Clay dust has worked its way so deep into the whorls of their fingerprints that it might be permanent. These are hands that understand how river clay differs from upland clay, how moisture content affects malleability, and how quickly different thicknesses dry in a different weather. You watch as Ninshuba prepares a fresh tablet, working the clay with steady pressure, neither hurried nor hesitant. This isn't the first map they've made, probably not even the 50th, and the process has acquired the rhythm of ritual. Add water, knead, test the consistency by pressing a thumb into the mass and watching how quickly the depression holds its shape. Too wet, and the marks will slump and blur. Too dry, and the stylus will drag and tear rather than incise cleanly. The clay has moods, Ninshubur says, noticing your attention. You have to meet it where it is. This isn't a metaphor. Clay gathered in spring, when snowmelt swells the river, contains different sediments than clay gathered in late summer, when the water runs slow and clear. Clay from the East Bank has more sand. Clay from the West has more organic material, tiny fragments of decomposed plants that make it darker and slightly more plastic. A good map maker knows these variations the way a musician knows the particular voice of their instrument. Today's map will document something more complex than the earlier attempts. Trade routes that connect multiple settlements across a region roughly the size of what will one day be called a province. The challenge isn't just spatial, though that's difficult enough, but temporal. These routes change with the seasons. A pass that's navigable in summer becomes choked with snow in winter. A river ford that works in the dry season becomes a deadly crossing when autumn rains swell the current. How do you show time on a two-dimensional surface? How do you map not just where, but when? Ninshubur's solution is layering. First, they press the basic geography into the clay, rivers as wavy lines, settlements as circular depressions, and mountains as triangular marks that slightly rise from the surface. Then comes the innovation. Different colours of pigment will indicate different seasons. Red for summer routes, blue for winter, yellow for spring and autumn, when either path might work depending on that year's weather. The pigments themselves are small miracles of chemistry and patience. The red comes from ochre, iron-rich clay gathered from a specific hillside 3 days' journey north, then roasted in fire until it deepens to the colour of rust. The blue required more invention. Crushed azurite, a copper-based mineral traded from the eastern mountains mixed with gum arabic harvested from acacia trees to help it bind to the clay surface. The yellow is simpler, just more ochre, but raw rather than roasted, producing a shade somewhere between honey and old bone. Ninshubur works with tools you wouldn't necessarily recognise as advanced technology, but which represent generations of refinement. A stylus cut from river reed, its tip kept sharp by frequent trimming. A pointed bone from a bird's wing, perfect for fine detail work. A smooth stone worn concave by years of use, ideal for burnishing clay surfaces to prepare them for pigment. A set of thin wooden strips carved to precise widths, used to maintain consistent thickness when rolling out the clay base. You notice something else. A series of older tablets stacked in one corner of the workshop, each one documenting a previous version of the map now being created. This isn't the first attempt. Map-making has become an iterative process, each generation of cartographers building on the knowledge and mistakes of their predecessors. See this one? Ninshubur lifts an older tablet, its surface worn but still legible. Made by my teacher's teacher. They marked a mountain pass that everyone used for 2 generations. Then an avalanche closed it, maybe 20 years ago. Now we route around. The old map shows the closed pass with the same certainty as the open ones. A confident line, incised deep into the clay, suggesting a permanent feature of the landscape. But landscapes aren't permanent. They shift and change, sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically. Rivers alter their courses, landslides block routes, settlements grow or disappear. A map that was true yesterday might be dangerously false today. This creates a philosophical problem that Ninshubur clearly wrestles with. Should old maps be destroyed when they become outdated, preventing someone from relying on false information, or preserved as historical documents, evidence of how the world once was? The workshop's collection suggests Ninshubur has chosen preservation, but with a system. Retired maps are marked with a small symbol in the upper left corner, a circle bisected by a wavy line, indicating that the information might no longer be current. As the work continues, you realise you're watching something more than technical craft. You're observing the development of a visual language, a system of symbols that can convey complex information to anyone who learns to read them. A settlement represented by a circle, a walled settlement by a circle with small marks around its perimeter suggesting fortifications, a seasonal camp by a circle with a dotted rather than solid line. The conventions are being invented in real time, negotiated through use, and refined when they prove confusing. A young apprentice named Kubaba arrives carrying a message tablet from one of the trading settlements to the west. She's perhaps 14, old enough to be trusted with valuable communications, but young enough that everything still fascinates her. She sets down the message tablet and immediately gravitates toward the map in progress. "Why is the western mountain blue?" she asks, pointing to a peak that Ninshubur has marked with azure pigment. "It's not blue," Ninshubur says, amused. "Blue means winter. The route over that mountain only opens in summer. But the mountain itself, it is grey rock and snow. But I'm not showing you what colour the mountain is. I'm showing you when you can cross it." Kubaba's face does something complicated. The expression of someone whose understanding is being reorganised at a fundamental level. She's learning to read the map not as a picture, but as a code. The colours don't represent the literal appearance of the landscape. They represent the human relationship to that landscape, the seasonal rhythms that govern access and movement. This is the leap that makes maps powerful and also potentially confusing. They're not meant to be realistic depictions, they're meant to be useful abstractions. The difference matters enormously, though it will take thousands of years before cartographers fully articulate the distinction. Ninshubur returns to work, and you watch the map emerge with the patience that excellence requires. Each symbol is placed with consideration. The spacing between marks is carefully calibrated to suggest relative distances without attempting precise scale. At one point Ninshubur pauses, stylus hovering over a section of clay, clearly debating something internal. "There's a shrine here," they finally say, speaking to no one in particular. "Small thing, just a stone marker where travellers leave offerings for safe passage. Should it be on the map?" The question hangs in the air. From a purely practical standpoint, a wayside shrine might not seem essential to navigation. But shrines mark places people consider significant. They're waypoints, psychologically, if not geographically. They provide reassurance. You're on the right path, others have passed this way, and the gods are watching. Ninshubur decides to include it, marking the shrine with a small star-like symbol. The choice reveals something about the map's purpose. It's not just documenting physical geography, but sacred geography. The landscape is experienced by people for whom the world is alive with meaning beyond mere terrain. The afternoon grows hot, and Ninshubur works more slowly, giving the clay time to firm up between additions. Too many marks pressed into soft clay too quickly can cause the entire surface to distort, turning precise symbols into illegible smears. Patience isn't just a virtue here, it's a technical requirement. During one of these enforced pauses, Kubaba asks a question that seems simple, but isn't. "How do you know where to put things?" Ninshubur considers this seriously. "Sometimes I know because I've travelled the route myself. Sometimes because someone I trust has told me, and I believe their description. Sometimes because multiple people have told me the same thing, so I trust the consensus. And sometimes..." They pause. "Sometimes I'm guessing based on how the world usually works. What if you guess wrong? Then someone travels to a place that doesn't exist or can't find a place that does, and they come back angry or confused, and I make a new map with better information. That's how knowledge grows, through mistakes corrected." You find this answer oddly moving. It's an admission that maps are always provisional, always subject to revision, and always dependent on the imperfect knowledge of their makers. Perfect accuracy isn't just unattainable, it might not even be the goal. The goal is usefulness. The goal is helping people move through the world with slightly less uncertainty than they'd have without the map. As evening approaches, Ninshubur applies the last of the pigments, then sets the tablet in a specific spot near the workshop's single window, where tomorrow morning's sun will strike it first and help the colours set. The map will need several days to dry completely, then a careful firing in a low-temperature kiln to make it truly permanent. You study the finished work in the fading light. It's beautiful in its way, this clay rectangle covered with incised lines and daubed colours. But more than beautiful, it's brave. It's an assertion that the world, despite its complexity and constant change, can be partially known, partially captured, and partially shared. Every mark on this tablet represents an act of confidence. I have walked this path, I remember this place, and I can help you find your way. Will it last, you ask, thinking about the fragility of fired clay and how easily it might crack or crumble. Ninjaba shrugs. Long enough, probably. Does it need to last forever? The question catches you off guard. You've been thinking about these maps as attempts at permanence, efforts to preserve knowledge beyond individual human lifespans. But maybe that's wrong. Maybe they're meant to be temporary, useful for a generation or two before conditions change enough that new maps become necessary. Maybe their value lies not in eternal truth, but in present usefulness. That night, you dream of maps dissolving in rain, their careful symbols washing away into illegibility, the accumulated knowledge of careful hands returning to formless mud. But in the dream, this isn't tragic. New hands are already kneading new clay, pressing new marks and adapting the old knowledge to new conditions. The maps die so that mapping can live. You wake with your palms tingling, as if they remember the feeling of wet clay even though you never touched it. As if the craft of map-making has become communicable through observation alone, a kind of knowledge that passes through the eyes and settles somewhere deeper than conscious thought, waiting for the moment when careful hands might need it. The map in front of you this morning is unlike any you've encountered before. You're in what might generously be called a sacred precinct, a small temple complex dedicated to a river goddess, whose name sounds like water moving over stones. The map maker here is both cartographer and priest, roles that nobody bothers to distinguish because they are understood as two aspects of the same calling. This map depicts the same physical region you've been learning, the river valley with its settlements and trade routes, but transformed by layers of theological interpretation. The river itself isn't just represented as a wavy line, it's drawn as a serpent, with scales indicated by careful cross-hatching and eyes marked at the source where the goddess is believed to dwell most strongly. The settlement circles you've come to recognise now have symbols inside them. Some show offerings, some show temples, and one shows what might be a curse or a blessing, depending on how you interpret the viewer-specific symbolism. The priest cartographer is called unhurried. Yes, that name, or a version of it, is the same one that will echo through history attached to the world's first named poet, though this particular person makes maps instead of verses, or maybe maps are just another form of verse. The distinction grows fuzzy here, where the sacred and the practical interweave so tightly that separating them would damage both. You're wondering about the serpent, unhurried says, not looking up from the delicate work of painting tiny scales along the river's length. You admit that yes, the serpent has caught your attention. The river is a serpent, has been for longer than anyone remembers. She sheds her skin every spring when the floods come, leaving rich soil behind. She can be gentle or deadly, depending on her mood. She provides and destroys. What else would she be but a serpent? The logic is airtight within its own frame of reference. You're not looking at metaphor here, not exactly. You're looking at a culture that experiences the divine as completely immanent in the natural world. The river isn't like a goddess, it is a goddess. Mapping the river's geography and mapping the goddess's nature are therefore the same act. But this creates interesting cartographic challenges. How do you represent a river that's simultaneously a physical feature requiring accurate navigation and a divine entity requiring proper respect? How do you balance the practical need to show ford crossings and irrigation channels with the theological need to show places where offerings should be made, or where the goddess's displeasure might manifest as dangerous currents? Unhurried's solution is integration. The map contains multiple layers of information, some practical, some spiritual, but all presented as equally real and equally important. Near the serpent's tail, downstream where the river spreads into marshland before reaching the sea. Small symbols indicate fishing grounds, but these same symbols are positioned to suggest where the goddess is most receptive to petitions from fishermen. The map guides both your boat and your prayers. A young temple attendant brings tea, setting it down carefully beside Enheduanna's workspace. The map is spread across a larger surface than the portable tablets you've seen before. This one is meant to be permanent, installed in the temple where pilgrims and traders can consult it. The clay is consequently thicker, the firing will be hotter, and the whole thing is designed for durability across generations. Some people think this is wrong, Enheduanna says abruptly, still working. Mixing the practical with the sacred. They say maps should show only what you can touch and measure. What do you think? I think those people have never really looked at a river, never watched how it changes moods with the seasons, how it remembers droughts and floods, or how it carries memory in its current. If you only map what you can measure, you miss what's most true. You consider this carefully. There's wisdom in it, but also danger. If every map becomes a theological document, doesn't that make it harder for someone who worships different gods to use the information? If a traveller from a distant land arrives and needs to find their way across the river valley, will they be able to extract useful navigation from a serpent-scaled map that assumes cultural knowledge they don't possess? Almost as if reading your thoughts, Enheduanna gestures to a second tablet nearby. This one's simpler and more functional. We make both kinds, they explain. The sacred map for those who belong here, who know the river's nature, and the traveller's map for strangers who just need to find their way. But the sacred map is the true one. The other is just, they search for words, instructions. The distinction makes sense within its context. The elaborate temple map captures the world as experienced by people who live in a relationship with it, who have emotional and spiritual connections to every marked location. The simplified traveller's map reduces that world to pure function. Here is water, here is shelter, and here are the turns you must make. One tells you what things mean, the other just tells you where they are. As Enheduanna continues working, you notice other theological elements woven into the cartography. The mountains to the north aren't just triangular marks. They're marked with symbols indicating which peaks are home to sky gods, which valleys are sacred to hunting deities, and which passes require offerings before attempting the crossing. This is navigational information of a sort, but it assumes a worldview where propitiating local divinities is as practical a consideration as checking the weather. A merchant arrives seeking permission to consult the map. She's planning a trading expedition and wants to verify the route. Enheduanna waves her over, and you watch as the merchant's eyes scan the Serpent River, clearly seeing past the theological overlay to extract the practical data beneath. She traces a route with her finger, noting where tributaries feed into the main channel where settlements cluster thick enough to promise good trading, and where the map indicates safe camping spots. The blessing marks, she says, pointing to small symbols you hadn't fully understood. Are these the spots where the current is gentle? Enheduanna smiles. The current is gentle where the goddess is peaceful. Same thing. The merchant accepts this with a small nod, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, simply acknowledging that within this cultural framework, theological and physical explanations are two languages describing the same reality. She makes a few notes on a small clay tablet she's brought with her, copying key information, then leaves a small offering at the temple altar before departing. After she's gone, you ask Enheduanna something that's been puzzling you. What happens when the river changes course, when physical reality contradicts the sacred map? The goddess has moved, Enheduanna says simply. The map shows where she is. If she's elsewhere, we update the map. Her nature doesn't change, just her location. This is a remarkably sophisticated theological position wrapped in simple language. It allows for revision and correction without requiring admission of error. The map wasn't wrong, the divine simply shifted. It's a framework that permits adaptation while preserving authority, and you can see how it would make updating maps religiously permissible. even in a culture where challenging sacred texts might be dangerous. The afternoon light shifts, and in Hiduana begins the detailed work of adding what they call story marks, small pictographic sequences that indicate narratives associated with particular locations. Here, a hero crossed the river during a flood to save a child. There, a famous treaty was sealed between rival settlements. Over there, a prophet had a vision that changed local agriculture practices. These aren't geographic features in the conventional sense, but they're landmarks of memory, places made significant by events. You realise you're watching the map become a compressed cultural encyclopedia, a document that contains not just spatial information, but historical, theological and social knowledge. Someone who can read this map fluently doesn't just learn how to navigate the river valley. They learn who they are, who their ancestors were, what their gods demand, and what their culture values. But this richness has a cost. The map has become so culturally specific that it's almost useless to outsiders. A stranger might recognise the river's basic shape, might pick out the settlement markers, but they'd miss most of the meaning. They'd be like someone reading poetry in a language they barely speak, getting some words, missing the music. Do you worry that you're making these maps too complicated, you ask? That they'll become impossible for anyone but specialists to read? And Hiduana considers this for a long moment. Maybe, but better a map that tells the truth completely to a few people than one that gives everyone a simplified lie. The world is complicated. Maps that pretend otherwise are the dangerous ones. You're not entirely convinced. Simplification isn't necessarily lying. It's choosing which truth to emphasise for a particular purpose. A traveller's map that omits theological details isn't claiming the gods don't exist. It's just focusing on the information that particular user needs, but you can appreciate in Hiduana's position. For them, divorcing geography from belief would be like mapping the human body while omitting the organs, technically possible, but missing what makes the thing alive. As evening approaches, Hiduana begins the final touches, adding small dots of white pigment made from crushed shells to indicate sacred springs, using red ochre to mark sites where blood offerings are appropriate, and drawing careful spirals at the boundaries between territories governed by different deity aspects of the river goddess. Each addition layers meaning onto meaning, building a document that is simultaneously a map, a religious text, a historical record, and a cultural manifesto. When it's finally finished, you stand back to take in the whole composition. It's breathtaking and bewildering, beautiful and confusing. The Serpent River dominates, coiling across the clay surface with undeniable presence. Around it, human settlements cluster like offerings, connected by trade routes that double as pilgrimage paths. The mountains loom, home to powers that must be acknowledged, and everywhere, tiny marks and symbols add depth and nuance, whispering stories to those who know how to listen. Will people in the future understand this, you ask? And Hiduana shrugs. Will people in the future understand us? Maps are like language. You need the key to unlock them. Someday, maybe, someone will find this and see only clay and colour, no meaning. Or maybe they'll be smart enough to recognise a masterpiece of integrated knowledge. Either way, we made it true to how we experience the world. That's all we can do. That night, lying in the darkness, you think about the relationship between belief and perception, between the world as it is and the world as we understand it. Every map is an argument about reality, a claim about what matters and what can be ignored, what's essential and what's ornamental. Sacred maps don't hide this fact. They make it explicit, acknowledging that all observation is interpretation, all representation is choice. You dream of serpent rivers and god mountains, of a landscape where every rock has a name and every name has a story, where you can't separate the geography from the meaning because they are woven together too tightly to tear apart. When you wake, you're not sure if you've been dreaming or remembering, whether the map you saw was external or internal, or whether any difference between those categories truly exists. You find yourself walking a familiar path, though the season has shifted. Winter is approaching. bringing cold winds that carry the smell of distant snow. The journey takes you to a settlement nestled in foothills, where people understand landscape primarily through the network of relationships that sustain them. Here, the map you're about to witness is being created not by a single artisan, but by a council of people whose combined knowledge forms a more complete picture than any individual could produce. The gathering happens in a large common building, warmed by a central hearth where embers glow like small suns. 8 people sit in a rough circle, and in the centre, on a smooth wooden board covered with damp clay, a map slowly emerges through conversation and negotiation. The first speaker is an elderly shepherd whose face suggests a lifetime of weather. The highland pasture, she begins, pressing her thumb into the clay to create a circular depression, is where the summer grazing is good, but only after the snow melts, and only if you can negotiate with the clans who claim it from the other side. This single mark contains layers of information: seasonal availability, resource quality, and political complexity. The pasture isn't just a place, it's a summer relationship, a shared territory requiring diplomacy as much as navigation. A younger man, a hunter, adds his knowledge. The game trails cross here and here, he marks 2 lines with a thin stick, but the deer change their routes depending on water availability. In wet years, they come down early. Dry years, they stay high longer. You notice that he's not drawing the trails as fixed features, but as tendencies, possibilities that shift based on conditions. The map is accumulating conditional knowledge. If this, then that. It's less a snapshot and more a field guide to probabilities. A woman who gathers medicinal plants speaks next. The healing herbs cluster near the 3 springs, but the middle spring sometimes dries up in late summer, so you can't rely on it. She makes 3 small marks, then adds a symbol beside one to indicate its unreliability. What fascinates you is how this council-created map emphasises connections over locations. The highland pasture matters because of its relationship to the settlement, distance, to the seasons, timing, to neighbouring clans, politics, and to the shepherd's livelihood, personal stakes. Every mark on the clay refers not just to a geographic feature, but to a web of relationships radiating from that feature. An older trader contributes routes, but he describes them in terms of relationships between settlements, rather than abstract paths through empty space. From here to the river, Ford is a 2-day journey with loaded pack animals, but you have to stop at the halfway camp where Mikhail's family welcomes traders in exchange for news. They're expecting you. If you don't stop, they'll be offended, and that makes future journeys harder. This isn't just logistical information, it's social instruction. The map is documenting a relationship network as much as a geographic one. The route isn't just the physical path, it's the social obligation to maintain connections with people along the way. A younger woman, perhaps 30, speaks hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. The northern ridge has changed since the landslide 3 winters ago. The old trail is gone. We've cut a new one, but it's steep in places. My daughter almost fell last spring. Mark it as dangerous for children. Her contribution is immediately accepted, and the clay is revised to show the new reality. The map adapts, incorporating recent information without questioning the speaker's authority. Everyone here understands that landscape knowledge is earned through lived experience, and this woman's near loss of her daughter has given her expertise that demands respect. Throughout the discussion, disagreements arise, but they're negotiated with remarkable patience. When 2 people describe different routes to the same destination, both routes are marked, with small symbols indicating which is faster, which is safer, which offers better water sources, and which is passable only in certain seasons. The map grows complex, sometimes confusing, but undeniably comprehensive. An old man with gnarled hands, a stoneworker who's spent decades quarrying building material from local outcrops, adds his knowledge of the physical landscape. The good granite is here, he indicates a location on the northern edge of the mapped area, but the overhang is unstable. We lost 2 men there, maybe 20 years back. People should know before they go cutting stone. His addition is both practical and memorial. The mark on the map honours the dead while protecting the living, transforming tragedy into transmitted wisdom. The landscape carries memory, and the map helps that memory persist beyond individual recall. As the mapping session continues, you begin to understand something fundamental about how these people conceptualize space. They don't think in terms of Cartesian coordinates or geometric precision. They think in terms of journeys and experiences, of relationships and obligations, of seasonal rhythms and social debts. The question isn't where is it, but rather how do you reach it, and what do you need to know before you try? A middle-aged woman, a weaver who trades finished cloth for raw materials, contributes information about the valley settlements to the south. But she doesn't just mark their locations. She indicates which communities prefer which colours, which settlements pay in grain versus livestock, and which families are related through marriage and therefore might offer better trading terms to someone they perceive as connected to their kin network. The map is becoming a document of economic relationships, kinship ties, political alliances and personal histories, all overlaid on basic geography. To someone from outside this cultural context, it would be nearly impossible to extract useful information. But to these people, every mark resonates with meaning, activating memories and knowledge that the map itself only partially contains. Halfway through the afternoon, someone brings food, bread, cheese and dried fruit, and the mapping pauses for shared eating. The break isn't a distraction from the work. It's part of the work, a reminder that map-making is a social act, that knowledge creation happens through community consensus, rather than individual authority. During the meal, the youngest person present, a boy of perhaps 12 named Kieran, asks a question that makes several adults smile. Why don't we just write down everything we know in words? Why make pictures in clay? The elderly shepherd answers gently, "Try this. Close your eyes and tell me how to get from your house to the highland pasture using only words." Kieran closes his eyes and begins describing the route. Go out the north door, turn left, follow the stream until... He falters, struggling to convert visual memory into linear language. Maps help us see it all at once, the shepherd explains. They show relationships that are hard to capture in sequences of words, everything connected to everything else, visible together. This is a profound insight about cognitive tools. Maps leverage spatial memory, allowing the human mind to perceive patterns and relationships that would be obscured by purely verbal description. You can see the whole territory at once, grasp the spatial logic, and understand how parts relate to the whole. After eating, the council returns to work with renewed focus. Now they're adding what they call wisdom marks, symbols indicating places associated with specific knowledge or cautionary tales. A mark shows where a famous elder once predicted a flood by reading subtle signs in the landscape. Another indicates a spot where unusual weather patterns regularly form, creating local conditions different from the surrounding area. A third marks where a particular type of clay can be dug that's perfect for pottery, but toxic if ingested. Each wisdom mark comes with a story, and you realise the map is designed to trigger storytelling. An elder teaching a young person to navigate this landscape would use the map as a prompt, allowing each symbol to open into a narrative explanation. The map isn't meant to replace oral knowledge transmission, it's meant to enhance it, providing a visual framework that supports and organises spoken wisdom. As evening approaches and the light begins to fail, someone brings oil lamps, and the work continues by flickering light. The map is nearly complete now, dense with information, almost overwhelming in its detail, yet somehow it remains coherent, because everyone involved shares the cultural knowledge needed to decode the symbols, to recognise the conventions, and to read between the lines. The final act is blessing the map. The oldest person present, a woman so elderly her age has become uncertain, but whose memory reaches back further than anyone else's, places her palm flat on the clay, and speaks words you don't fully understand. They sound like prayer, but also like naming, as if by touching the represented landscape she's linking the map to the territory, creating a kind of sympathetic magic between the image and the reality. When her hand lifts, it leaves a perfect print in the clay, the lines of her palm and the creases of her fingers unique as identity. The others murmur approval. The handprint will remain, fired into permanence, a signature that says this knowledge was touched by human hands, created by human minds, and blessed by human wisdom. Will this map last? You ask the same question you've asked before, but here it feels different. The weaver answers, long enough for our children to learn from it, to add their knowledge, and to make better maps when our world changes. That's all we need. You study the finished map in the lamplight. It's not beautiful in any conventional sense. Too cluttered, too dense with overlapping symbols, too specific to its cultural moment. But it's honest. It shows the world as relationships, which is perhaps the most accurate representation possible. Because what is a landscape, really, except a network of connections between people, places, resources, dangers, and memories? That night, sleeping in a guest house with the wind rattling the shutters, you dream of walking through the mapped landscape. In the dream, every marked location speaks when you approach, telling its story, explaining its significance. The map has become three-dimensional, temporal, and animated by the knowledge of everyone who contributed to its creation. You walk trails that are simultaneously physical paths and social obligations, cross rivers that are both water and boundary, and climb mountains that are both rock and sacred presence. When you wake, the dream logic persists for a moment, and you understand something essential. All maps are dreams of mastery, attempts to make the overwhelming complexity of the world manageable through representation, but the best maps know their dreams. They acknowledge their incompleteness, their subjectivity, and their necessary distortions. They serve truth by admitting they're not the truth, only a tool for approaching it. You find yourself in a strange position, observer of an observation, archaeologists from a distant land, people who speak a different language and worship different gods, have discovered an ancient map in the ruins of a long-abandoned settlement. The map is perhaps 200 years old, created by a culture that no longer exists in recognizable form, and these scholars are attempting to interpret what they've found. The map itself is impressive. A large clay tablet, well preserved by the dry climate, covered with symbols and marks that clearly represent some kind of geographic information. But the original context has been lost. Nobody alive speaks the language that might explain the symbols. No living tradition preserves the knowledge of what specific marks meant. You watch as the chief archaeologist, a careful, methodical woman named Dr. Sarai, examines the map through the lens of her own culture's cartographic traditions. She recognizes the wavy lines as probably representing a river. The circular marks might be settlements. The triangular symbols could be mountains. So far, so good. But then the interpretations grow more speculative. The map includes colour variations, areas marked in red, blue, and yellow. And Dr. Sarai assumes these indicate different political territories, like the colour-coded maps her culture uses to show kingdoms and provinces. Here, she points, is clearly the border between the Red Kingdom and the Blue. See how the colours meet but don't overlap? Except that's not what the colours mean at all. You know, because you've witnessed this map's creation in an earlier time. The colours indicate seasons, red for summer roots, blue for winter, and yellow for spring and autumn. The map isn't showing political divisions in space, it's showing temporal availability. The entire interpretation is backwards, but Dr. Sarai has no way to know this. She's reading the map through the only framework she has available, her own culture's cartographic conventions, and by those conventions her interpretation makes perfect sense. The mistake isn't stupidity, it's the inevitable result of trying to decode one culture's symbol system using another culture's key. A younger scholar named Marcus examines the serpent-shaped river and offers his interpretation. Clearly decorative, the mapmaker was adding artistic flourishes to make the document more impressive, perhaps for a royal patron. The scales are just ornamental detail. You want to laugh or cry or both. The serpent isn't decorative, it's theological, representing the river as a divine entity. But to Marcus, who comes from a culture where maps are purely functional documents, the idea that cartography might serve spiritual purposes doesn't occur to him. He's not wrong to find the interpretation difficult, he's simply missing the conceptual framework that would make it obvious. The team continues their analysis, growing more confident as they identify patterns and make connections. They notice that some settlement markers are larger than others, and conclude this indicates population size or political importance. Actually, the size differences indicate something else entirely. The larger marks show settlements where the map's creators had family connections, places of personal significance rather than objective metropolitan scale. They catalogue the wisdom marks as probably representing resources or dangers, not entirely wrong, but missing the narrative dimension, the way each symbol is meant to trigger a specific story that contains nuanced knowledge. The handprint at the map's edge particularly puzzles them. One scholar suggests it's a signature, while another proposes it might be a symbolic representation of creation or divine authorization. Both interpretations have merit, but both also miss the mark. The handprint is blessing, memory and authentication all at once, a way of saying this knowledge passed through these hands that can't be adequately captured by any single explanation the scholars propose. What's fascinating is watching how the archaeologists construct an entirely coherent interpretation based on incomplete information and cultural bias. Their reading of the map makes perfect sense within their framework. They're not being foolish or careless. They're doing exactly what any intelligent person would do, using available evidence and known patterns to construct plausible explanations. The tragedy is that their well-reasoned conclusions are largely wrong. Doctor Sarai develops an elaborate theory about the map representing a trade network between rival kingdoms, with the coloured zones indicating spheres of influence and the various symbols marking trading posts, defensive fortifications and resource extraction sites. She presents this interpretation to her colleagues with careful argumentation, supporting each claim with evidence from the map itself. The evidence does support her interpretation if you accept her premises. The problem is that the premises are wrong, rooted in assumptions about what maps are for and how they function that simply don't apply to this particular document. One evening, you observe a fascinating argument between Dr. Sarai and Marcus about a series of small marks clustered near one section of the river. Dr. Sarai believes they indicate multiple settlements in close proximity, suggesting a region of high population density. Marcus thinks they are symbolic representations of productive agricultural land. Neither considers that the marks might indicate fishing grounds, shrine locations, and places where specific medicinal plants grow, a clustering of resources rather than people or fields. The concentration here, Dr. Sarai argues, pointing to the cluster, suggests this was the cultural and economic heart of the civilization that created this map. Probably the capital city or at least a major population centre. Marcus counters, or the breadbasket that fed the civilization. Agricultural surplus is what allows complex societies to develop. This concentration of marks could represent the farmland that sustained the culture. They're both applying frameworks from their own era, where concentrated settlement or intensive agriculture would indeed be marked prominently on maps. They're not wrong to think this way, they're just thinking about the wrong kind of map. The misunderstandings multiply. The archaeologists completely miss the conditional nature of many marks, interpreting variant routes as representing different time periods, rather than different seasons or different purposes. They struggle with the theological overlay, alternately dismissing sacred elements as primitive superstition, or over-interpreting them as evidence of religious warfare between competing cult centres. At one point, a graduate student named Leah tentatively suggests that maybe the map represents something other than political geography, perhaps ecological knowledge or seasonal patterns. The senior scholars acknowledge this as an interesting thought, but ultimately dismiss it as unlikely, because maps, in their experience, primarily serve political and military purposes. The idea that a culture might invest significant resources in mapping seasonal resource availability strikes them as improbable. You watch this dismissal with a mixture of amusement and frustration. Leah was closer to the truth than her mentors, but her insight got overruled by their greater experience with a completely different cartographic tradition. The team eventually publishes their findings, a detailed analysis of what they interpret as a political-economic map from an ancient civilization, showing territorial divisions, trade routes, and population centres. They acknowledge uncertainties and gaps in their interpretation, maintaining appropriate scholarly caution about claims made from limited evidence. The work is professional, thorough, and substantially incorrect. Years later, you imagine, other scholars might revisit this map with new frameworks, proposing alternative interpretations. Some might be closer to the original meaning, others might drift even further afield. The map will accumulate layers of scholarly interpretation like sediment, each generation reading it through their own cultural lenses, finding in it reflections of their own assumptions about what maps are and how they work. This is the paradox of archaeological interpretation. We can only understand the past through the conceptual tools of the present, but those tools are often inadequate to the task. We modernize the ancient, make it familiar, and force it into categories that help us process it but also distort its original nature. The night before the archaeological team leaves the site, you overhear Dr. Sarai and Marcus having a more philosophical conversation over evening tea. Dr. Sarai muses about the limits of their knowledge. We'll never really know what this map meant to the people who made it. We can make educated guesses and build plausible interpretations, but the original context is lost. All we can do is be honest about our uncertainty, Marcus agrees, adding, "Maybe that's okay though. Maybe every generation needs to interpret the past through their own lens. Our reading of this map says as much about us as it does about them." It's a moment of unexpected wisdom, acknowledging that interpretation is always a conversation between past and present, always shaped by the interpreter as much as the interpreted. They're wrong about the map's specifics, but right about the broader epistemological point. Perfect understanding across cultural and temporal distance might be impossible. All we can do is try our best and admit our limitations. You think about the original map makers, the council that spent days creating this document, embedding it with layers of meaning that will never be fully recovered. Their careful work has been misunderstood, reinterpreted, and forced into alien frameworks. Is this tragedy? Or is it just the inevitable fate of all human communication across sufficient distance? Maybe both. The map survives and carries some meaning forward, even if that meaning has mutated in transmission. The archaeologists learn something, even if not exactly what the map makers intended to teach. Knowledge persists, imperfectly but persistently, adapting to new context because perfect preservation is impossible. As you drift towards sleep that night, you imagine a future even more distant, where Dr. Sarai's published interpretation itself becomes an archaeological artifact, studied by scholars trying to understand early 21st century archaeological methods. They'll find her work quaint, limited by the conceptual frameworks of her era, and making assumptions that seem obvious to them will seem bizarre. And they too will be partly right and partly wrong, reading the past through the only lens available, their own present. The map outlasts all its interpreters, silent and patient, meaning whatever each generation needs it to mean, carrying forward fragments of truth wrapped in layers of misunderstanding, neither entirely lost nor fully preserved, existing in the twilight space between past intention and present interpretation, where all historical knowledge lives. The excavation happens slowly, with the patience that archaeology demands. You're observing a different site now in a different era, where a team of modern researchers is carefully exposing an ancient archive, Among the clay tablets and ceramic fragments, they found something unexpected, a collection of early maps, preserved by a fortunate collapse that buried them in airless conditions before fire or water could destroy them. The site director is a patient man named Dr. Ishan, whose hands shake slightly with excitement as he photographs each tablet in situ before moving it. "We thought this was just a granary complex," he explains to his team. "Storage for surplus grain, maybe some administrative records. But this," he gestures to the mapped tablet still half buried in sterile soil, "this changes everything. The maps are diverse, created over what must be several generations. Some are simple and functional, showing basic geographic relationships. Others are elaborate, dense with symbolic meaning that will take years to decode. Together they constitute an archive of geographic knowledge from a culture that has been dead for millennia." The excavation proceeds with excruciating slowness. Each tablet must be documented in place, photographed from multiple angles, and carefully removed with tools that wouldn't look out of place in a surgeon's kit. The soil around each map is collected for analysis. Maybe it will contain pollen or other organic material that helps date the artifacts or understand their context. A young graduate student named Amara has been assigned to create preliminary sketches of each map as it's exposed, capturing the symbols and marks before the tablets are moved to the conservation lab. You watch her work crouched in the dusty trench, translating three-dimensional artifacts into two-dimensional drawings with painstaking accuracy. "This one's different," she says, studying a tablet that's just been fully exposed. "See how the riverline has these small marks along it? Not like the others." "Doctor." Ishan crouches beside her, careful not to disturb the artifact. "Could be settlements, could be shrines, could be something we haven't thought of yet." He smiles at his own ignorance, clearly delighted by the puzzle. The team begins to recognize patterns across the map collection. Several tablets show the same basic region but with variations, different symbols, different emphasis, and sometimes quite different spatial relationships. At first, this seems like a contradiction. Which map is accurate? But gradually they realize they're not looking at errors but at different purposes. One map emphasizes water sources, another focuses on agricultural zones, a third seems to show sacred sites and pilgrimage routes. They weren't trying to make one perfect map, Amara realizes. They were making specialized maps for different uses, like how we have road maps and topographic maps and political maps, all showing the same place but highlighting different information. This insight shifts their interpretation of the entire archive. Instead of primitive attempts at a single true representation, they're seeing a sophisticated culture that understood maps as purpose-built tools, created differently depending on intended use. It's evidence of cartographic sophistication that nobody expected from this time period and region. The conservation lab receives the tablets like precious patience. Each one is cleaned with tools and techniques that would seem absurd if the artifacts weren't so valuable. Soft brushes, distilled water applied drop by careful drop, and hours of patient work to remove millennia of accumulated dirt without damaging the underlying surface. As the maps are cleaned, details emerge that weren't visible in the field. Colours that seemed faded prove to be vibrant under proper lighting. Symbols that appeared to be simple marks reveal themselves as complex pictographs when examined under magnification. The maps are more information-dense than the excavation team initially realised. Dr. Ishan's team expands to include specialists in ancient languages, religious historians, geographers who can identify features in the ancient landscape that still exist today, and even anthropologists who study how different cultures conceptualize space. The maps have become a multidisciplinary research project, each expert bringing different frameworks for interpretation. A breakthrough comes from an unlikely source. Dr. Elena, a scholar of ancient irrigation systems, recognizes a pattern in how water is represented across multiple maps. "These aren't natural waterways," she explains, pointing to a network of carefully marked lines on one tablet. "These are irrigation channels, and these marks here, these might indicate sluice gates or control points." Her insight opens new lines of inquiry. If the maps show irrigation infrastructure, they might also indicate the political organisation required to build and maintain such systems. Irrigation requires coordination, which requires authority, which means these maps might contain embedded information about social hierarchy and governance. Another scholar, Dr. James, specialises in archaeoastronomy. He notices that several maps include marks that don't correspond to any obvious geographic features. What if these aren't maps of Earth at all, he suggests? What if some of these tablets map the sky? The team examines the relevant tablets more carefully and confirms his hypothesis. Mixed in with the geographic maps are several celestial charts, showing constellations and planetary positions. The ancient mapmakers apparently didn't distinguish sharply between mapping Earth and mapping heaven. Both were aspects of understanding and navigating the cosmos. The archive continues to reveal surprises. One tablet, initially dismissed as too damaged for useful analysis, proves under careful restoration to contain what might be the earliest known attempt at showing scale. Small marks along one edge appear to be a measuring system, some kind of standardized unit that allowed users to estimate actual distances from the represented distances on the map. If this is what I think it is, Doctor, Ishan says, examining the restored tablet with barely contained excitement, they were thinking about scale 3,000 years ago. That's earlier than any other evidence we have for this kind of mathematical cartography. Not everyone on the team agrees with his interpretation. Some argue the marks might be decorative or perhaps represent something other than measurement. The debate continues, civil but intense, with each side marshalling evidence and argumentation. This is science at its best. People following evidence toward truth while acknowledging uncertainty. As months turn into years, a clearer picture of the ancient map-making culture emerges. They were agriculturalists living in a river valley, dependent on complex irrigation for survival. They engaged in long-distance trade, travelled seasonal routes to access different resources, and maintained relationships with neighbouring groups that ranged from cooperative to hostile. They had a rich spiritual life that saw divinity in landscape features. They valued knowledge preservation enough to invest significant resources in creating permanent records. The maps themselves become characters in academic papers and conference presentations. Scholars argue about their interpretation, propose new readings of ambiguous symbols, and debate the cultural values embedded in cartographic choices. The tablets that once sat silent in darkness now spark conversations across continents, connecting researchers who will never meet the people who created these artifacts, but who feel a strange intimacy with them nonetheless. Public interest follows academic discovery. The maps are featured in museum exhibitions, photographed for textbooks, and reproduced in popular science articles. People who've never thought about ancient cartography find themselves fascinated by these clay rectangles covered with marks that represent a vanished world. You observe one such exhibition, watching visitors move past glass cases containing the displayed maps. Most people pause only briefly, unable to fully grasp what they're seeing without extensive context. But a few linger, studying the symbols, trying to decode the meaning, feeling some connection across millennia to the hands that press these marks into wet clay. A child asks her parent what the maps are for, and the parent reads the placard text. These maps helped ancient people navigate their world and preserve knowledge for future generations. It's a simplified explanation, but essentially accurate. The child nods, satisfied, and moves on to the next exhibit. That night, in a research library half a world away, Dr. Shan works late on a comprehensive publication about the map archive. He's trying to write in a way that's accessible to educated readers while maintaining scholarly rigour, trying to convey both what they know and what remains uncertain, and trying to honour the intelligence and sophistication of the ancient mapmakers while acknowledging the enormous gaps in modern understanding. It's harder than he expected. The maps resist simple explanations. They contain depths that reveal themselves gradually, that require patient attention and willingness to question assumptions. They're teaching him humility, these ancient tablets, reminding him that human intelligence and creativity aren't recent innovations but ancient inheritances. He writes, "These maps challenge our assumptions about primitive and advanced, about the linear progression of human knowledge. They suggest that sophistication and simplicity can coexist, that technological limitation doesn't imply intellectual poverty." The people who made these maps thought carefully about representation and abstraction, about how to capture complexity in limited media, and about what knowledge matters enough to preserve. The words feel inadequate, but he continues writing, trying to build a bridge between the ancient map makers and modern readers, knowing the bridge will always be imperfect, but hoping it might carry some traffic nonetheless. As you watch him work, you think about the strange journey these maps have taken, from hands that shaped them with purpose and care, through millennia of darkness and forgetting, into laboratories and museums where they're studied and preserved and misunderstood, and partly understood and valued in ways their creators never imagined. The maps have outlasted the civilization that produced them, the language that explained them, and the cultural context that made them fully meaningful. They persist as fragments, eloquent but incomplete, speaking a language that requires translation and interpretation and imagination to access. And yet they speak. They carry forward something essential about human beings' need to understand and represent their world, to create tools for navigation and knowledge preservation, and to leave marks that say, "I was here, I knew this, and I wanted you to know it too." The quiet rediscovery continues, patient and ongoing, probably eternal. Each generation will find something different in these ancient maps, will ask new questions and develop new interpretations, and will see reflections of their own concerns and interests. The maps will never be fully understood, but they'll never be exhausted either. They'll keep offering insights, puzzles, and connections across time. You leave Dr. Rashan to his writing and step outside into the night. The stars are sharp and clear, mapping the sky above as ancient cartographers once mapped it below, unchanged in pattern if not in meaning, still guiding travellers as they have for all of human history, still teaching the lesson that maps have always taught. The world is large and we are small, but understanding is possible, and the attempt to understand is what makes us human. You find yourself in a peculiar space, not quite past, not quite present, but somewhere between memory and imagination, where the map you've been following through these chapters finally reveals its full nature. This is the oldest map on Earth, though calling it old seems wrong. It was new once, revolutionary even, created by minds as sharp and creative as any that followed. The tablet sits on a simple pedestal, lit by indirect sunlight filtering through windows you can't quite see. You're alone with it, finally able to look without the mediation of archaeologists or priests or traders or anyone else's interpretation. Just you and the clay and the marks pressed into it thousands of years ago by hands that have long since returned to dust. The first thing that strikes you is how confident the marks are. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Someone knew exactly what they were doing when they created this. The lines are deliberate, the symbols carefully placed, and the overall composition balanced despite its apparent simplicity. This isn't primitive work. It's economical work, creating maximum meaning with minimum means. You begin to trace the elements, reading them not for what they show, but for what they reveal about the thinking that created them. The river dominates because the river dominated life in that place and time. Its serpentine form isn't decorative or superstitious. It's essential truth captured in visual metaphor. The river is alive, changeable, and powerful. How else would you represent that except as a living thing? The settlement markers vary in size not because the map maker couldn't maintain consistency, but because consistency wasn't the goal. Size indicates importance, but importance is measured by relationship and meaning rather than objective population. The large marks show places that mattered to the map maker and their community. The small marks show places that existed but held less significance in the network of care and connection that made life possible. The symbols scattered across the tablet, each one a condensed packet of knowledge, aren't primitive attempts at more sophisticated notation. They're sophisticated attempts at maximum information density using available technology. Each symbol can trigger extensive knowledge in someone who shares the cultural context. They're mnemonic devices, memory aids, and keys that unlock whole libraries of orally transmitted wisdom. You notice details you've overlooked before. The clay itself varies in texture across the tablet's surface, smoother in some areas, rougher in others. This might be intentional, using tactile variation to encode additional information, allowing the map to be partially read through touch as well as sight. A map for fingertips as well as eyes. The edges of the tablet show wear patterns suggesting frequent handling. This wasn't created and then archived. It was used, consulted and touched by many hands over years or decades. The wear adds its own kind of meaning. This knowledge mattered, this map served a real purpose, and these marks guided actual journeys and decisions. You find yourself thinking about the word primitive, which scholars will eventually apply to maps like this. The word suggests simplicity, naivety, and the early fumbling attempts that precede more advanced work. But nothing about this map is fumbling. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, and doing it with elegant efficiency. The map makers understood constraints. They knew clay imposed limitations. It couldn't capture fine detail like parchment, couldn't be easily amended like chalk on slate, and couldn't be reproduced like a printing press would someday allow. So they worked within those constraints, making choices that optimize for durability, information density, and usability given available materials. They understood purpose. This map wasn't trying to be objective or comprehensive. It was trying to be useful to specific people for specific purposes. Objectivity was less important than relevance. Comprehensiveness was less valuable than focused utility. These aren't failings. They're design decisions, and sophisticated ones. They understood symbolism. The marks on this tablet operate at multiple levels simultaneously. They're literal, this line is the river. Metaphorical, this line is the goddess. And functional, this line shows where to find water, all at once. The map makers weren't confused about these different levels. They were integrating them, understanding that human relationship to landscape is always multidimensional. They understood time. Many elements of the map encode temporal information, seasonal availability, the sequence of waypoints on a journey, and the cycle of flooding and drought. The map isn't a snapshot of a single moment, but a representation of patterns that recur, knowledge that remains valid across time because it captures regularities rather than ephemeral conditions. Most impressively, they understood limits. The rough marks at the map's edges, the areas left blank, and the symbols that indicate uncertainty or danger. All of these acknowledge that knowledge is incomplete, that the known world has boundaries, and that honesty requires admitting ignorance. The map doesn't pretend omniscience. It clearly delineates between this we know and this we don't. You think about how this will be received when archaeologists eventually discover it. They'll measure it against their own cartographic standards and find it wanting. They'll note its lack of scale, its distorted proportions, and its mixing of pragmatic and symbolic elements. They'll use words like crude and rudimentary, and yes, primitive. But they'll be wrong, or at least incomplete in their judgment. They'll be evaluating the map against criteria it was never trying to meet and purposes it wasn't designed to serve. It's like criticising a knife for being a poor hammer. The criticism reveals more about the critic's expectations than the tool's quality. This map is sophisticated in ways that will take centuries for cartography to rediscover. It understands that all representation is interpretation. It acknowledges that objectivity is impossible and perhaps undesirable. It prioritizes usefulness over accuracy, meaning over measurement, and relationship over geometric precision. These are lessons that modern cartography will eventually relearn, but only after a long detour through the fantasy of perfect objective representation. You notice something else. the handprint pressed into the clay near the edge. You've thought about this before, but now it takes on new significance. That handprint is a signature, yes, but it's also a declaration. A human made this. Human knowledge, human effort, and human care went into these marks. The map isn't trying to be God's eye view or some impossible objective truth. It's explicitly, unapologetically human, limited, subjective, and situated, but nonetheless valuable. The afternoon light shifts, changing how shadows fall across the tablet's surface. Marks that were invisible moments ago suddenly appear. Others recede into shadow. The map is revealing itself gradually, refusing to be fully known in a single glance. It has depths. You think about all the maps that will follow this one, the increasingly elaborate attempts to capture the world in parchment and paper, and eventually pixels. Many will be more accurate in the measurable sense. None will be more true in the deeper sense of capturing how it feels to live in a landscape, to depend on its resources, to fear its dangers, and to carry its knowledge in your body as well as your mind. The tablet before you isn't a primitive precursor to better maps. It's a different kind of map entirely, serving different purposes with different assumptions about what mapping means. Later cartography won't surpass this so much as diverge from it, pursuing different goals that require different methods. This map and its descendants in the Western cartographic tradition will eventually part ways so completely that they'll be nearly incomparable. One tradition will value precision, scale, and objective representation of measurable features. The other would have continued valuing relationship, meaning the integration of physical and spiritual geography. Both are valid. Both serve real purposes. Neither is primitive. Neither is advanced. They're different solutions to different problems. As the light continues to change, you make a final observation. The map is beautiful. Not in the sense of artistic achievement or aesthetic perfection, but in the sense of fitness to purpose, elegance of solution, and honest representation of complex reality. It's beautiful the way a well-made tool is beautiful, the way a perfectly functional object achieves grace through pure utility. You step back, taking in the whole tablet one last time. Somewhere someone is pressing marks into wet clay, creating tomorrow's ancient map, preserving today's knowledge for a future they'll never see. The work continues, the human need to understand and represent and preserve. The technology changes, the impulse remains constant. The oldest map on Earth is trying to tell you this. Human beings have always been intelligent, always been creative, and always been capable of sophisticated thought and careful work. The tools change, the media evolve, but the fundamental human capacities to observe, to remember, to symbolize, to preserve, to transmit, these are ancient beyond reckoning. Before this map was called primitive, it was called essential. Before it was a curiosity in a museum case, it was a tool for survival. Before archaeologists puzzled over its meaning, travellers consulted it for life-saving information. Before scholars debated its sophistication, it was simply the best available technology for solving a critical problem. The map endures not despite its age, but because of its fundamental soundness. It did what it needed to do, it served its purpose, it captured knowledge and transmitted it across generations. What more can any map aspire to? You turn away finally, leaving the tablet to its eternal patience. It will be here when you return, when anyone returns, silent and eloquent, waiting to teach anyone willing to learn the lesson it's been teaching, since the moment those careful hands pressed the final marks into damp clay and set it aside to dry. The lesson about human capability and creativity, and the eternal need to make sense of the world we inhabit, to map not just where we are but who we are, not just the geography of Earth, but the geography of understanding, the terrain between ignorance and knowledge where all human progress occurs. Outside, the world continues in its ancient patterns. Rivers flow, mountains stand. People walk paths worn smooth by countless feet before them. And somewhere, always, someone is trying to capture this in symbol and mark, creating maps that future archaeologists will someday puzzle over, that future cultures will misunderstand and partly understand, and eventually value not for what they got wrong, but for what they got profoundly right about the eternal human project of trying to know and show the world. The oldest map on Earth is trying to tell you that you are part of this lineage, this continuous chain of observers and markers and preservers. Your mind contains maps of your own world, internal cartographies of space and relationship and meaning. You are, in your own way, a map maker too, pressing marks into the clay of consciousness, trying to capture and preserve and transmit what you've learned, knowing it will be imperfect, knowing it will be misunderstood, knowing it will endure because the human need to map is as fundamental as the need to breathe, as ancient as awareness itself, and as persistent as the rivers that carved valleys in landscapes that existed long before anyone thought to mark them in clay, and long after all our careful cartographies have crumbled back to earth. In the early decades of the 15th century, somewhere in the heart of Europe, someone sat down with fresh vellum and began to create something utterly strange. What emerged was a book filled with drawings of impossible plants, celestial diagrams that followed no known astronomy, and page after page of flowing script in an alphabet that belonged to no language anyone had ever seen. 600 years later, that book still sits in a library at Yale University, its secrets as impenetrable as the day its pages were first bound together. You're in a room where the light comes in sideways through a window with uneven glass. It's morning, probably spring, somewhere between 1400 and 1430. Though the exact year doesn't particularly matter to the person sitting at the wooden table. What matters is the smoothness of the vellum beneath their fingers, the way the quill moves when the ink is exactly the right consistency, and the patience required to fill page after page with symbols that curl and loop in ways that almost look like writing. The room smells like oak gall and iron salts, the sharp tang of ink mixed with the animal smell of the prepared calfskin pages. Outside, you can hear a cart passing on a cobblestone street, the steady clop of hooves, and someone calling out about fish or bread or whatever needs selling before noon. Inside, there's just the scratch of the quill, the occasional pause to dip it again, and the soft sound of a page turning. The person making this book, and will probably never know who they were, works with the kind of attention you give to things that matter. Each character is formed deliberately, not rushed, not careless, but not precious either. This is someone who has made marks on pages before, who knows how ink behaves, and who understands that vellum is expensive and shouldn't be wasted. The writing flows in neat lines across each page, left to right, just like Latin or Italian, or any of the other languages that people wrote in back then. The symbols themselves are tidy, consistent, and pleasantly curved. They look at first glance like they should mean something, but if you could lean over this person's shoulder and try to sound out the words, you'd find yourself stuck almost immediately. The alphabet contains somewhere between 19 and 28 distinct characters, depending on whether certain variations count as separate letters or just stylistic choices. Some symbols appear constantly, showing up in almost every word. Others arrive rarely, like shy guests at a gathering. The combinations follow certain patterns. Some characters never appear at the start of words, others never show up at the end, and certain pairs seem to go together as naturally as salt and bread. The manuscript grows slowly, page by page, day by day. The writer adds illustrations, though calling them illustrations makes them sound more straightforward than they are. There are plants, or things that resemble plants, drawn with careful attention to roots and leaves and flowers. Except the roots don't quite match any real root system, and the leaves arrange themselves in ways that would make an actual plant fall over, and the flowers bloom with geometries that nature generally avoids. Some of the plants seem almost recognizable. You might glance at one and think, oh, that's probably some kind of herb. But then you notice the strange extra petals or the way the stem branches in 3 directions before spiralling back on itself. There are astronomical diagrams, wheels within wheels, covered in the same mysterious script. There are what appear to be recipes or instructions, short paragraphs of text next to stars or circles or small drawings. There are pages showing naked women in pools of green liquid, connected by an elaborate system of tubes and chambers that looks vaguely biological and vaguely architectural and vaguely like plumbing from a dream about being lost in a bathhouse designed by someone who had only heard baths described second-hand. The person creating all this doesn't seem frustrated or confused by what they're doing. They work steadily and systematically, filling about 240 pages with this strange content. Sometimes they go back and add notes in the margins. Sometimes they correct small errors or add details to drawings. It's the behaviour of someone working from knowledge, not someone making random marks to create the appearance of a book. When they finish, and we don't know if they finished what they intended or just stopped, the manuscript is bound, not expensively, but competently. The kind of binding you'd give to a book that matters, but isn't meant to impress wealthy collectors. Then it goes somewhere, into a library maybe, onto a shelf, into whatever system of storage and organisation existed wherever this book was made. And then, for a long time, nothing much happens. Books in the 15th century don't vanish easily, but they don't exactly leave clear trails either. The Voynich manuscript, though it won't be called that for centuries, passes through hands we can only partially trace. It sits on shelves in cities whose identities we can guess at but not confirm. People own it, or at least keep it, though what they think they own remains wonderfully unclear. Sometime in the late 1500s, the manuscript surfaces in Prague. We know this because someone writes a letter about it. Georg Baresch, an alchemist living in Prague, mentions owning a book full of hieroglyphics that he can't read but finds fascinating. He's spent years staring at it, trying to work out if it contains secret knowledge about plants and stars and the natural world. He describes his relationship with the book the way you might describe living with a cat that refuses to acknowledge your existence. A mixture of genuine affection and mild resentment at being so thoroughly ignored. Baresch sends the manuscript to a Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher, who collected strange and wonderful things the way some people collect grievances. Kircher was the sort of man who believed he could decode anything, having previously convinced himself he'd translated Egyptian hieroglyphics decades before anyone actually managed that particular feat. If anyone could read this mysterious book, Baresch figured, it would be Kircher. Kircher receives the manuscript and does what scholars in the 1600s typically did with puzzling items. He stares at it for a while, writes some notes that don't help, and then files it away with all his other interesting objects. The manuscript sits in Kircher's collection at the Collegio Romano, just another curiosity in rooms full of unusual instruments, mysterious artefacts, and probably a few things that were just regular rocks that looked interesting in certain light. The book rests there for over 200 years. Not forgotten exactly, but not particularly remembered either. It becomes part of the background inventory, the kind of item that gets mentioned in catalogues with descriptions like codex containing unknown writing and botanical illustrations. Occasionally someone new would encounter it, page through it with puzzled interest, maybe make a note to investigate it properly later, and then get distracted by life's more pressing demands. When Italy unified in the late 1800s, and the Jesuit order fell on difficult times, the collection needed to be sold. Books and artefacts were boxed up, catalogued and dispersed. The manuscript ended up in a villa outside Rome, part of a larger collection purchased by the Collegio Romano from the Jesuits, stored in wooden chests that smelled of old varnish and centuries of Italian summers. This is where Wilfrid Voynich enters the story, and where the manuscript finally gets a name. You have to imagine Wilfrid Voynich as the kind of person who couldn't walk past a locked trunk without wondering what was inside. Born in Poland, a revolutionary in his youth, imprisoned in Siberia and escaped to London, married to a novelist, Voynich had transformed himself into a rare book dealer with the particular obsession of someone who had spent time in a Russian prison cell with nothing to read. He didn't just sell books, he hunted them, pursued them, and tracked them through archives and estate sales and forgotten storage rooms like a detective, following leads on a case that mattered deeply, but only to him. In 1912, Voynich found himself at the Villa Mondragone, where the Jesuit collection sat in rooms that hadn't been properly sorted in decades. He was going through chests of books, that particular combination of excited and methodical that good book dealers maintain, when he encountered something that made him stop completely. The manuscript looked old. That much was obvious from the vellum and the binding. But it was the content that grabbed him. Page after page of writing in an unknown script. Illustrations that seemed simultaneously careful and impossible. Diagrams that suggested scientific knowledge, but in a visual language he couldn't pass. Voynich had handled thousands of rare books in his career, but this was something entirely different. This was either the most significant find of his professional life or an elaborate historical prank, and at that moment he couldn't tell which. He purchased it, along with other manuscripts from the collection, and brought it back to America. Then he did what any sensible person would do when confronted with something completely inexplicable. He showed it to everyone he could find who might have useful opinions. Voynich brought the manuscript to cryptographers, medievalists, botanists, astronomers, linguists, and anyone whose expertise might crack even a small part of the mystery. He had photographs made of the pages and distributed them to scholars across Europe and America. He wrote letters describing the manuscript's features, its apparent age, and its utterly baffling content. He was careful not to claim too much. He presented it as a genuine mystery, not as something he'd already solved. But you can feel his excitement in those letters, the thrill of owning something that resisted every attempt at understanding. The scholars responded with fascination and complete failure. Cryptographers applied every code-breaking technique they knew and found nothing that worked. Botanists looked at the plant illustrations and couldn't match them to any known species, though some seemed tantalizingly close to real plants, as if someone had drawn a daisy but given it 17 petals arranged in a spiral that nature never quite manages. Astronomers examined the celestial diagrams and found arrangements that didn't correspond to any historical understanding of the stars, though again, some elements seemed almost right, like a map of the sky drawn by someone who had heard descriptions of constellations but never actually looked up. The manuscript resisted every approach. It wasn't that scholars found clues and couldn't follow them. It was that clues kept dissolving the moment anyone looked at them directly. A pattern would emerge in the text, suggesting grammatical structure, and then immediately contradict itself on the next page. An illustration would seem to depict a known plant until you notice the impossible root system, or the flowers growing directly from the leaves. One linguist, studying the statistical patterns of the text, found that it behaved like natural language in some ways. Certain characters appeared with the right frequency, words seemed to have appropriate lengths, and the flow of text looked like writing rather than random symbols. But in other ways, it was completely wrong. Words repeated too often. Certain combinations appeared far more frequently than they should in any real language. It was like reading something that had been designed to look like language by someone who understood the general principles, but had never actually spoken or written a real sentence. Voynich died in 1930, still not knowing what his manuscript contained. His widow, Ethel, inherited it, and eventually sold it to another rare book dealer. The manuscript changed hands a few more times, each owner presumably hoping to be the one who finally solved it, before ending up at Yale University's Beinecker Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where it sits today in a climate-controlled room, still refusing to explain itself. For decades, one of the basic questions about the Voynich manuscript remained unanswered. When was it actually made? Voynich and the early scholars had guessed somewhere in the 15 or 1600s based on the style of illustration and the type of vellum, but guessing and knowing are different activities entirely. In 2009, the manuscript underwent radiocarbon dating. Small samples of the vellum, pieces so tiny they barely counted as fragments, were analysed using techniques that measure the decay of carbon-14 isotopes. It's the kind of dating method that sounds more magical than it is. You're essentially counting how long it's been since the animal whose skin became these pages stopped eating grass and breathing air and engaging in all the other activities that incorporate trace amounts of radioactive carbon into living tissue. The results came back placing the vellum between 1404 and 1438, with the most likely date around 1420. This was older than many scholars had expected, pushing the manuscript back into the early Renaissance, a time when the world was just starting to transition from medieval manuscripts to printed books. But here's the thing about radiocarbon dating vellum. You're dating when the animal died, not when someone wrote on its skin. Vellum was expensive, and it wasn't unusual for scribes to stockpile it, letting prepared pages sit for years or even decades before using them. So the manuscript could have been created any time after 1420. It could have been made in 1421, or 1460, or 1500. The vellum gives us a starting point, not an ending one. The ink, frustratingly, can't be dated with the same precision. The pigments used for the illustrations contain materials that exist in too many time periods to narrow things down. Medieval ink was often made from oak galls, iron salts, and water, ingredients that don't change much across centuries. Without unique chemical signatures, the ink just tells us that it's old, which we already knew from looking at it. What the dating did confirm was that this wasn't a 19th century forgery created to fool collectors, which had been one persistent theory. The manuscript was genuinely old, genuinely medieval, and genuinely made before printing presses turned books into reproducible objects. Someone in the early 1500s really had sat down and filled these pages with undecipherable script and impossible plants and astronomical diagrams that didn't match the sky. This knowledge somehow made the manuscript more mysterious, not less. A modern fake would have been disappointing but understandable. People forge things for money or fame or the simple pleasure of fooling experts. But a genuine medieval manuscript in an unknown language suggested something stranger. That someone 600 years ago possessed knowledge or beliefs or intentions that we still can't fathom, despite all our computational power and linguistic databases and collective scholarly attention. The manuscript wasn't made as a joke for future generations to puzzle over. It was created for some purpose, by someone, in a world where vellum was valuable and time was limited, and making a 240-page book required genuine commitment. Whatever its purpose was, it mattered enough to justify months of careful work. One of the most persistent questions about the Voynich manuscript is whether the text represents actual language at all. Not which language, or what it says, but whether the symbols encode meaning in the way that writing normally does, where specific sounds or concepts attach to specific marks, allowing thought to travel from one mind to another across time and distance. The text looks like language. This seems worth emphasising because it's easy to gloss over just how convincingly language-like it appears. The symbols flow in consistent directions. They arrange themselves into discrete words separated by small spaces. The words vary in length, but cluster around patterns you'd expect in real text. Mostly short words, fewer medium words, and occasional long words. Certain symbols appear more frequently than others, following what linguists call Zipf's law, a statistical pattern that shows up in virtually every human language where common words appear much more often than rare ones. If you chart the frequency of symbols in the Voynich text against the frequency of letters in, say, English or Latin or Italian, you get distributions that look remarkably similar. The most common symbol appears about twice as often as the second most common symbol, which appears about twice as often as the third, and so on down the line. This isn't what you'd get from random marks or decorative patterns. This is the signature of structured information. But then you look closer, and things start seeming wrong, in ways that are hard to articulate at first. Words repeat far more often than they should. Some words appear 2 or 3 times in a single line, or start consecutive sentences, or show up dozens of times on a single page. Real languages don't typically behave this way. You might say the frequently in English, but you rarely write the. unless you're being deliberately strange or discussing the word itself. The manuscript also shows a peculiar lack of variation in word length within individual sections. Pages of the botanical section will contain mostly short words of 3 or 4 characters. Pages of the astronomical section will suddenly shift to longer words of 7 or 8 characters. It's as if different parts of the manuscript follow different rules, or as if the writer was adjusting some underlying system to match the subject matter. Even stranger, words in the manuscript seem to follow strict patterns about which symbols can appear in which positions. Certain characters only show up at the beginning of words, others only appear at the end. Some combinations never occur, as if there's a grammar to the writing that prohibits certain arrangements. This happens in real languages too. English doesn't allow words to start with ng, for instance, but the manuscript takes it to an extreme. It's almost too organised, too systematic, as if someone built a language-like system with very rigid rules and then followed those rules absolutely. Linguists have fed the text into computer programs that analyse statistical patterns in writing. These programs can usually identify what language something is written in, even if they can't translate it, by recognising characteristic patterns in how symbols combine and arrange. The Voynich text confuses these programs completely. It shows features of language but doesn't match any known language family. It has structure, but not the kind of structure that natural languages evolved to have. Some researchers have suggested it might be an early attempt at creating an artificial language, a philosophical language, of the sort that became popular in the 1600s, where symbols represented concepts rather than sounds. Others think it might be an extremely unusual cipher, where the encoding process somehow created these strange statistical properties. Still others believe it could be glossolalia, invented words that follow unconscious patterns without actually meaning anything, like speaking in tongues but written down with meticulous care. The most frustrating possibility is that it might be all and none of these things simultaneously. Perhaps it's a system that uses elements of natural language, elements of code, and elements of invented structure, combined in ways that create something that looks tantalizingly meaningful, while actually encoding nothing at all. Or perhaps it encodes information in such an unusual way that we keep looking right past the meaning because we're expecting writing to behave like writing normally behaves. You can spend hours staring at a page of Voynich text and your brain will insist it should make sense. The symbols are too regular, too carefully formed and too systematically arranged to be nonsense. But then you try to find patterns, and the patterns dissolve. You think you've spotted a repeated word that might be important, and then you realise it appears in contexts that seem completely unrelated. You notice that certain symbols almost always appear together, and then you find a page where they never appear together at all. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces fit together perfectly, but the resulting image doesn't depict anything recognisable. Everything clicks into place. Nothing makes sense. If you're the kind of person who enjoys botanical illustration, the Voynich manuscript will delight and frustrate you in equal measure. The plant drawings demonstrate genuine skill and careful observation. Roots spread in convincing tangles. Leaves show proper venation patterns. Flowers display the kind of detailed structure that suggests someone looked at actual plants before putting pen to page. But then you try to identify any of them, and you discover that none quite exist. There are plants that resemble sunflowers, except the petals are wrong, and the leaves grow from impossible locations on the stem. There are plants that look vaguely like various species of morning glory, but with root systems that belong to completely different families. One illustration appears to show something related to the water lily, but the flowers emerge from a geometric arrangement that no real water lily has ever achieved. Botanists have spent decades trying to match these drawings to known species. Every so often, someone announces they've identified one. This illustration is clearly a European variety of some herb, or that drawing definitely represents a particular type of Mediterranean wildflower. But then other botanists look at the same illustration and point out all the features that don't match, all the impossible combinations of characteristics that would never appear in a single plant. The problem is that each illustration contains multiple features that are almost right. You'll have a root that looks exactly like it belongs to one plant family, attached to a stem that's clearly from a different family, topped with flowers from yet another family entirely. It's as if someone took a botanical knowledge of European plants and then deliberately scrambled the characteristics, creating new impossible combinations that look plausible at first glance, but fall apart under scrutiny. Some researchers have suggested that the plants might be stylized representations, simplified drawings that capture essential features while ignoring others. Medieval and Renaissance botanical illustration often took liberties with accuracy in favour of recognizability or symbolic meaning. But even allowing for stylization, the Voynich plants are too consistently wrong in too many specific ways. They're not simplified versions of real plants. They're carefully detailed illustrations of plants that don't exist. Another theory proposes that these might be plants from other regions, exotic species that European botanists in the 1500s wouldn't have recognised. Perhaps the manuscript was created somewhere in Asia or the Americas, depicting local flora that would have seemed utterly foreign to European eyes. The problem with this theory is that botanists have now catalogued plants from across the globe, and none of them match the Voynich illustrations any better than European species do. If these plants exist somewhere, they've hidden themselves remarkably well. The most unsettling possibility is that the plants are purely invented, drawn by someone with enough botanical knowledge to make them seem plausible, but no interest in depicting reality. Perhaps they're meant to represent alchemical concepts or medical theories, with each impossible plant encoding some kind of symbolic meaning that made sense within whatever system of knowledge the manuscript represents. Or, and this is the thought that creeps in when you're looking at these drawings late at night, perhaps they're meant to depict plants that once existed but don't anymore. Lost species, extinct varieties, and things that grew in gardens that vanished centuries ago. It's almost certainly not true, but the illustrations are detailed enough, convincing enough, that part of your brain wants to believe these plants were real, that someone drew them from life, that somewhere in the early 1500s, a garden contained flowers that bloomed in impossible spirals and herbs with root systems that defied botanical logic. The drawings also include what appear to be pharmaceutical or recipe sections, showing these same impossible plants being processed, roots being extracted, leaves being prepared, everything illustrated with the same careful attention to detail that makes you think the person drawing this knew exactly what they were depicting, even if nobody since has figured it out. The astronomical and astrological sections of the manuscript present their own special category of confusion. There are circular diagrams showing what appear to be zodiac symbols, except they don't quite match any traditional zodiac. There are charts that might represent lunar phases or planetary movements, except the geometry doesn't correspond to how celestial bodies actually move through the sky. Some of the diagrams are beautiful in that particularly medieval way, where function and decoration blur together. Wheels within wheels, all covered in the mysterious script, with small illustrations of stars or suns or celestial objects scattered throughout. They look like they should represent some sophisticated astronomical knowledge, the kind of careful observation and mathematical understanding that was developing in the 1500s as scholars began to question old models of the heavens. But when astronomers analyse these diagrams, they can't match them to any known system of celestial mapping. The number of divisions in the wheels doesn't correspond to months or zodiac signs or lunar phases in any standard way. The symbols, while beautiful, don't match any astronomical notation from any culture that we know of. It's as if someone created a completely new system for tracking the movements of heavenly bodies, one that runs parallel to actual astronomy without ever quite intersecting with it. One section contains what appears to be a zodiac wheel, with figures that might represent zodiacal signs. You can make out shapes that could be fish or rams or human figures. But there are the wrong number of them, and they're arranged in an order that doesn't match any traditional zodiac sequence. It's like looking at a familiar constellation pattern that's been rotated and stretched until it's almost but not quite recognisable. The manuscript also includes what appear to be star charts or celestial maps, pages covered in small symbols that could represent stars connected by lines that might indicate constellations. Except again, they don't match any constellations that actually appear in the night sky, at least not from any location or time period that astronomers have been able to identify. They're too organised to be random, too systematic to be decorative, but too wrong to be accurate. Some researchers have suggested these might represent astrological rather than astronomical knowledge, not attempting to map the actual sky, but rather depicting symbolic relationships between celestial influences and earthly events. Medieval and Renaissance astrology often used complex diagrams to show how planetary positions affected human health, personality, and fate. The Voynich astronomical sections could be illustrating some system of astrological medicine or cosmic influence that doesn't match standard Western astrology, but might have made perfect sense within whatever intellectual framework produced the manuscript. The problem, as with everything in this manuscript, is that we're stuck interpreting without context. We see wheels and circles and what appear to be calendrical markers, and we recognise them as the kind of thing that usually represents time and celestial movement. We can't decode the manuscript's meaning without knowing its system and its assumptions about the cosmos. It's a bit like finding a clock from an alternate universe where time is measured differently. You can recognise that it's a timekeeping device. You can see that it has systematic divisions and markings, but you can't use it to tell time because you don't know what the numbers mean or how they correspond to the passage of hours. And then there are the bathing women, which might be the manuscript's stranger section, and that's saying something given the competition. Pages and pages show small naked female figures, drawn with economical lines and minimal detail, sitting in what appears to be water, or possibly some kind of liquid that the illustrator coloured green. The women are connected by an elaborate network of tubes and channels that flow between pools and vessels and chambers. It looks vaguely biological, vaguely architectural, and vaguely like a medieval diagram of the circulatory system crossed with a bathhouse, crossed with some kind of alchemical apparatus. The women themselves are drawn simply, almost schematically. They're not individualised portraits, but rather generic figures used to populate this strange landscape of connected pools. Some sit alone in circular vessels, others cluster together in larger chambers. The tubes connecting them branch and merge in ways that suggest flow and circulation, as if whatever liquid fills these pools is meant to move through the system in some meaningful pattern. Scholars have proposed numerous interpretations. Perhaps it's a diagram of balneological therapy, representing medieval theories about the healing properties of different kinds of baths. Perhaps it's an alchemical allegory, with the women representing different substances or stages in some transformation process. Perhaps it's astronomical or astrological, with each pool representing a celestial body and the women standing in for planetary influences. Or perhaps it's gynecological, depicting medieval understanding of female anatomy and reproduction in symbolic form. There are elements that could suggest this. The branching tubes might represent fallopian tubes or blood vessels, and the chambers might represent organs or bodily cavities. Medieval medical texts often used elaborate diagrams to explain reproduction and fetal development, and they frequently employed visual metaphors that seem bizarre to modern eyes. The honest answer is that nobody knows. The section is so unique, so different from anything in other medieval manuscripts that there's no good comparative material to work from. It's not that scholars can't think of interpretations, they can think of dozens. It's that none of the interpretations can be proven or disproven without being able to read the text that accompanies these illustrations. What makes this section particularly dreamlike is how calmly systematic it is. The women aren't engaged in any activity, they're just sitting in their pools, connected by their tubes, existing within this elaborate system that somebody carefully designed and illustrated. There's something both peaceful and unsettling about it, this vision of bodies linked together in green water, circulating through a structure whose purpose remains entirely opaque. If you stare at these pages long enough, and you probably shouldn't because it starts affecting your dreams, you begin to notice small details. Some women hold small objects, Some pools are marked with stars or symbols. Some tubes branch in complex patterns, while others run straight and simple. It all seems intentional, purposeful, as if each small variation means something within the overall system. But what that something is remains as mysterious as everything else in this endlessly puzzling book. For cryptographers, the Voynich manuscript represents either the ultimate puzzle or the ultimate disappointment, depending on whether they think it's actually encoded information or just an elaborate collection of meaningless symbols arranged to look significant. Professional codebreakers have been attacking this manuscript for over a century now, applying every technique from medieval ciphers to modern computational analysis. They've tried treating it as a substitution cipher, where each symbol represents a different letter. They've tried polyalphabetic ciphers, where the encoding system changes throughout text. They've tried treating it as a code, where symbols represent whole words or concepts rather than individual letters. They've tried assuming it's written in a known language that's been encoded, and they've tried assuming it's an unknown language written plainly. Nothing has worked. Not even close. The fundamental problem is that the text has statistical properties that don't match encrypted natural language. When you encrypt a message using classical cipher techniques, the underlying structure of the original language usually shows through in various ways. Letter frequencies might be disguised, but word lengths, grammatical patterns, and other features often remain detectable. The Voynich text doesn't show these characteristics, but it also doesn't show the characteristics of random gibberish or meaningless decoration. It's too structured, too internally consistent, and too carefully organised. Truly random arrangements of symbols wouldn't display the kinds of patterns that the Voynich text contains, the way certain symbols cluster together, the way words seem to have grammatical positions, and the way the whole thing gives the appearance of systematic writing. This has led some cryptographers to suggest that if the manuscript is encoded, it must be using an extremely unusual cipher system, something that wouldn't become common until centuries after the manuscript was created. Perhaps some kind of double or triple encoding where the text was encrypted. Then the encrypted text was encrypted again using a different system, creating something so thoroughly obscured that standard cryptanalysis techniques can't penetrate it. The counter-argument is that if someone in the early 1500s had developed such a sophisticated encryption system, one that still defeats modern computer analysis, they would have been a cryptographic genius far ahead of their time, and yet we have no other evidence of such advanced cipher work from that period. It requires assuming someone invented encryption techniques that wouldn't be developed for several more centuries, used them to encode a manuscript, and then the knowledge of how they did it completely vanished from history. Some codebreakers have approached the manuscript by trying to work backward from the assumption that certain symbols must represent common words or letter combinations. If you could find a symbol that means the, and, or another common word, you could decode more of the text. The problem is that every time someone thinks they've identified a meaningful symbol or pattern, they apply it to the rest of the manuscript and it falls apart immediately. What seems to work on one page fails completely on the next. There's also the question of whether the manuscript contains one text or multiple texts. Different sections use slightly different symbol frequencies and word patterns. It's possible that different parts were written by different people, or using different encoding systems, or perhaps even in different languages. If the manuscript is a compilation of several different texts, each encoded differently, then trying to find a single decryption key would be futile. You'd need multiple keys, and you'd need to know where each one applied. The most frustrating scenario for cryptographers would be if the manuscript isn't actually encoded at all. If the symbols don't represent anything linguistic, but rather some other kind of information entirely. Perhaps it's a musical notation, or a mnemonic system for memorizing other texts, or a representation of something we haven't even thought to consider. In that case, all the cryptographic analysis is fundamentally misdirected, trying to decode something that was never meant to be read as text in the first place. One persistent theory is that the Voynich manuscript is simply a hoax, an elaborate fake created to fool collectors or scholars, or perhaps just to amuse its creator. This theory has the advantage of explaining why nobody can read the text. There's nothing to read, just meaningless symbols arranged to look important. The problem with the hoax theory is that creating this particular hoax would have required an absurd amount of work for uncertain reward. Remember, the vellum dates to the early 1500s, so if this is a fake, it's a fake from the Renaissance era, not something created in the 19th century to fool collectors. Someone in the 1400s or 1500s would have needed to obtain over 200 pages of expensive vellum, spend months carefully writing out 40,000 words of invented text, while maintaining consistent statistical patterns, create detailed botanical illustrations of impossible plants, draw astronomical diagrams that look meaningful without depicting anything real, and illustrate sections showing complex systems of pools and tubes and women bathing. All of this for what purpose? Vellum was valuable. Time was valuable. The skills required to create a book like this, writing, illustration, binding, were professional skills that people normally use to earn a living. Creating the Voynich manuscript as a meaningless joke would be like someone today spending 5 years building an elaborate sculpture out of solid gold and then burying it in their backyard where nobody would ever see it. If it was intended to fool someone, to be sold as a valuable medieval text containing secret knowledge, then it seems to have failed at that goal for several centuries. It changed hands a few times, but doesn't seem to have commanded enormous prices or fooled major collectors. Georg Beresch owned it in the 1600s and tried to get it translated, suggesting he genuinely believed it contained meaningful information rather than knowing it was fake. If someone created it as a commercial fraud, the fraud was remarkably unsuccessful. Some researchers have suggested it might be a hoax in a different sense, not meant to fool others for money, but created as a kind of intellectual game or thought experiment. Perhaps someone wanted to see if they could create something that looked like it contained deep knowledge while actually being empty of content. A meditation on the nature of meaning and meaninglessness, written 600 years ago by someone who never expected anyone to spend centuries trying to decode it. But even this seems like an odd amount of effort for what would essentially be a private joke. The manuscript is too carefully made, too systematic in its construction, and too consistent across its many pages. It shows signs of being a serious work, not a frivolous one. The hoax theory also struggles to explain certain features of the text. If someone was just making up random symbols to look like language, you'd expect more variation, more randomness, and fewer of the subtle patterns that linguists and cryptographers keep finding. The statistical structure of the text suggests either natural language or an extremely sophisticated artificial system. Creating that kind of structure accidentally, just by randomly making up symbols, would be nearly impossible. So if it's a hoax created by someone with deep knowledge of how language works, who took enormous care to make their fake text display properties of real writing, who spent months or years on this project for no clear reward, and who then let it disappear into obscurity for centuries rather than trying to profit from it or take credit for their achievement, which isn't impossible. People do strange things for strange reasons, but it requires assuming motivations and behaviours that seem at odds with how people usually operate, then and now. When computers became powerful enough to analyse large amounts of text, researchers naturally turned them loose on the Voynich manuscript. Finally they thought, we have tools that can detect patterns humans might miss, statistical relationships too subtle for manual analysis, and connections between the text and the illustrations that could unlock everything. The computers found patterns. Many patterns. Too many patterns, really. And none of them led anywhere. Computational linguists fed the text into programs designed to identify language families. The programs reported that the manuscript's text showed characteristics similar to various natural languages, but didn't match any of them closely enough to make a definitive identification. Some analyses suggested it might be related to Southeast Asian languages. Others pointed toward Germanic or Romance language features. Still others indicated it could be an artificial language created from scratch. Researchers applied machine learning algorithms, training computers to recognize patterns in how symbols combine and arrange themselves. The algorithm successfully learned the manuscript's patterns and could even generate new Voynich-like text that looked convincingly similar to the original. But they couldn't explain what those patterns meant or how they related to actual information. One approach tried using the illustrations as a key to the text. If you could identify what the plant illustration showed, you might be able to match the accompanying text to plant names or botanical descriptions in known languages. The problem, as we've seen, is that the plants don't match anything identifiable, so this approach quickly dead-ended. Another technique involved analysing the physical structure of the manuscript, the order of pages, the way sections were bound together, and any evidence of pages being removed or rearranged. The goal was to reconstruct the manuscript's original structure, on the theory that understanding the intended organisation might reveal something about its purpose. This research confirmed that the manuscript's current page order is probably close to its original organisation, but didn't really clarify what that organisation meant. Some researchers have used computer analysis to identify different hands in the writing, looking for subtle variations that might indicate different writers or different time periods. The results are inconclusive. The writing is remarkably consistent throughout most of the manuscript, but there are sections that show slight variations in symbol formation or spacing. Whether these represent different writers, the same writer at different times, or just natural variation in handwriting remains debatable. The digital age has also made it easier to compare the Voynich manuscript to other medieval texts, looking for stylistic similarities or shared features that might provide context. Researchers have identified a few manuscripts with superficially similar illustration styles, and a few with comparable organisational structures, but nothing that offers a genuine understanding of what the Voynich text actually represents. In recent years, people have tried using artificial intelligence and neural networks, the same kinds of systems that can translate between languages or generate human-like text. The AI systems can learn to imitate the manuscript's statistical patterns, but they can't translate it or explain it any better than earlier approaches. They're just better at producing convincing nonsense that looks like the original. What the computer age has really done is confirm how deeply strange the manuscript is. Every new analytical technique reveals more patterns, more structure, and more evidence that these aren't just random marks on a page. But the patterns don't assemble into meaning. The structure doesn't reveal purpose. It's as if the manuscript exists in a category of its own, not quite language, and not quite non-language, not quite encrypted and not quite plain text, not quite coherent and not quite incoherent. The digital tools have also made the manuscript more accessible. High-resolution scans are freely available online. Anyone with internet access can examine every page, zoom in to see individual pen strokes and study the illustrations in detail. This democratization of access has led to thousands of amateur attempts at decipherment, new theories proposed every year, and clever people convinced they've spotted something everyone else missed. And they might have. That's the maddening thing about the Voynich manuscript. The solution could be obvious, something everyone keeps overlooking because they're approaching it wrong. Or it could be genuinely unsolvable because there's nothing to solve. The manuscript sits there, the same as it has for 600 years, perfectly willing to be examined but entirely unwilling to explain itself. There's something about the Voynich manuscript that captures certain minds and doesn't let go. People discover it, start examining it, and then find themselves still thinking about it years later, unable to completely abandon the puzzle, even when logic suggests they should move on to more productive obsessions. Some of these people are professional academics with relevant expertise, linguists, cryptographers, medieval historians who encounter the manuscript as part of their research and then get pulled deeper than they intended. They'll spend a summer analysing one section, planning to publish a brief paper and move on, and then find themselves still working on it a decade later, their office walls covered with enlarged illustrations and statistical charts showing symbol frequencies. Others are enthusiastic amateurs, people with no formal training in cryptography or medieval studies, but with good pattern recognition skills, and a stubborn refusal to accept that something this carefully constructed can't be understood, they spend evenings and weekends studying the text, developing elaborate theories, and writing long analyses that they share online or send to universities, convinced they're one insight away from cracking the whole thing. The manuscript attracts a particular kind of obsessive attention because it seems simultaneously accessible and impossible. You don't need specialized equipment to study it, just the images, freely available online, and your own analytical ability. It looks like it should yield to careful examination. The symbols are clear, the illustrations are detailed, and the structure is apparent. Unlike many historical mysteries that require rare access or expensive research, the Voynich manuscript sits there fully visible, inviting anyone to take a shot at decoding it. And then it defeats everyone. Professional cryptographers with decades of experience, computational linguists with sophisticated software, and amateur codebreakers who've successfully decoded other historical ciphers, they all hit the same wall. The manuscript absorbs their analytical attention without surrendering its secrets. This pattern has repeated for over a century now. Someone announces they've solved it. They've identified the language, or cracked the cipher, or recognized what the plants represent, or understood the astronomical diagrams. They publish their findings, sometimes in academic papers, sometimes in blog posts or self-published books. Other researchers examine their work and point out the flaws. The translation only works for a few words before breaking down, or the cipher system they've proposed doesn't match the statistical properties of the text, or their plant identifications require ignoring most of the features of the illustrations. The person who proposed the solution might defend it for a while, arguing that the critics are missing something, that their approach is more sophisticated than it appears, and that the problems are actually evidence of multiple encoding systems or deliberate obfuscation. Sometimes they'll revise their theory, adjusting it to account for the criticisms. More often, their solution quietly fades away, joining the hundreds of other proposed decodings that seemed promising until they didn't. What's interesting is how few people become bitter about this. You'd expect frustration and resentment at wasting time on an impossible puzzle, but many researchers who've spent years working on the manuscript speak about it with a kind of affection, the way you might talk about a difficult friend who enriches your life despite being frustrating. The manuscript has given them a puzzle worth solving, a mystery that remains genuinely mysterious in an age when most things can be Googled in seconds. There's also a community aspect to it. People working on the Voynich manuscript find each other online, share theories, critique each other's approaches, and collaborate on analysis. They attend conferences where they present their latest findings to others who understand why this particular medieval book matters so much. For some, the manuscript becomes a lifelong intellectual companion, a problem they return to whenever they need something genuinely challenging to think about. And occasionally, someone does make real progress, not solving the whole thing, but identifying something new, a statistical pattern nobody had noticed, a possible connection to another medieval text, a detail in the illustrations that provides context. These small discoveries don't crack the manuscript wide open, but they add to the collective understanding, making the mystery slightly more defined even if no closer to being solved. The manuscript has also inspired creative works, novels that imagine its origin story, artworks that remix its illustrations, and music based on its mysterious symbols. It's become a cultural object beyond just being a historical artifact, a symbol of the unknowable that resonates with anyone who appreciates a good mystery. After 600 years and countless attempts at understanding, what can we say with certainty about the Voynich manuscript? We know it's old, created sometime after 1404, when the animals who provided the vellum were alive, and probably not much later than the mid-1500s based on various contextual clues. We know it consists of roughly 40,000 words in an unknown script, accompanied by illustrations that don't match any known plants, astronomical systems, or symbolic traditions. We know it was created by someone with genuine skill in writing and illustration. The text is too consistent to be random marks, and the drawings show real artistic ability. We know it was carefully made, with attention to detail and consistent effort across many pages. We know it wasn't a quick project, but something that required significant time and resources. We know that whatever system it uses for encoding information, if it does encode information, is unlike any cipher or language that cryptographers and linguists have successfully identified. We know that people in the past took it seriously enough to preserve it, trade it, and try to understand it. We know that it ended up in collections of interesting and valuable books, rather than being discarded as obvious nonsense. We know that modern computational analysis has found patterns in the text that suggest structure and organization, but hasn't been able to match those patterns to any known language or cipher system. We know that the illustrations, while impossible to definitively identify, show enough detail to suggest they're depicting something specific, rather than being purely decorative or random. What we don't know vastly outweighs what we do know. We don't know who created it, or where, or exactly when, or why. We don't know if it's written in a natural language, an artificial language, or any kind of language at all. We don't know if it's encrypted, and if so, using what method. We don't know what the text says, what the plants represent, what the astronomical diagrams map, or what the bathing women signify. We don't know if it contains valuable knowledge, complete nonsense, or something in between. We don't know if it was meant to be read by others or was a private project never intended for outside eyes. We don't know if the solution is simple and we're just missing it, or genuinely complex or impossible because there's nothing to solve. This vast landscape of unknowing is, in its own way, remarkable. In the 21st century, with all our analytical tools and accumulated historical knowledge and computational power, this medieval manuscript remains fundamentally mysterious. It sits in its climate-controlled room at Yale, available for anyone to examine, and continues to keep its secrets. There's something almost comforting about this. In a world where most questions can be answered with a quick search, where mysteries get solved by crowds of online investigators, where privacy is increasingly difficult and knowledge seems endlessly accessible, the Voynich manuscript reminds us that some things still resist understanding, not because they're hidden or protected, but because they exist in a category we haven't quite learned to recognize. Maybe it will be solved someday. Maybe some researcher will stumble on the right approach, or some new technology will reveal something we've been missing, or some historical discovery will provide the context needed to understand what we're looking at. Maybe tomorrow, or next year, or in 50 years, someone will publish a definitive decoding, and the manuscript will finally give up its secrets. Or maybe it won't. Maybe it will sit there for another 600 years, outlasting our current civilization, still waiting for someone who can read it, or still guarding nothing more than the appearance of meaning. It's late now, and you're thinking about a book made 600 years ago by someone whose name you'll never know. You're imagining them in that room with sideways light, carefully forming each symbol, adding each illustration, working day after day on a project whose purpose remains completely opaque to everyone who's examined it since. What were they thinking? Did they know they were creating something that would baffle generations of scholars? Or were they simply doing work that made perfect sense to them, following a system so clear in their own mind that they never imagined it would become incomprehensible? Maybe they were recording knowledge they considered valuable, botanical information, astronomical observations and medical theories. Maybe they were encoding secrets they needed to protect. Maybe they were constructing an elaborate thought experiment about the nature of language and meaning. Maybe they were just filling time, creating something beautiful and complex because the act of creation itself was satisfying. You'll never know. Neither will anyone else, probably. The manuscript exists as a bridge that connects you to someone 600 years ago, but it's a bridge you can't quite cross. You can see evidence of their careful work, their systematic approach, and their commitment to this project. But you can't hear them explain what they were doing or why it mattered. And maybe that's okay. Maybe not everything needs to be understood to be valuable. Maybe the manuscript's greatest contribution is this reminder that mystery can persist, that careful work can create effects that outlast understanding, and that something made with attention and purpose can continue to command attention even when that purpose remains hidden. The person who made this book is gone. The world they lived in, where vellum was valuable and books were rare, and whatever knowledge system the manuscript represents made sense, is gone too. But the book remains, physical and present, its pages still intact, its symbols still carefully formed, its illustrations still detailed and impossible. It sits in its library, patient and inscrutable, the same now as it was 600 years ago. Still complex, still structured, still carefully organized, still completely mysterious. Still offering itself to anyone who wants to examine it, and still refusing to explain itself to anyone who does. You could spend your whole life studying it. Some people have. You could develop elaborate theories about what it means, run sophisticated analysis on its statistical properties, and compare it to every other medieval text you can find. You could become an expert on this one specific manuscript, knowing more about its physical properties and visual features than almost anyone alive, and you still wouldn't know what it says. You'd be in the same position as Georg Barisch in his house in Prague 400 years ago, staring at symbols that seem like they should mean something, feeling certain that meaning is there somewhere, and being completely unable to access it. But you'd have spent your time with something genuinely strange, something that doesn't fit into easy categories, something that has successfully resisted explanation despite centuries of intelligent people trying to understand it. You'd have lived with a real mystery, not a puzzle designed to be solved, or a riddle with an answer hiding in plain sight, but something that might not have an answer at all, or might have an answer so far outside normal categories of thinking that it remains invisible despite being right there on the page. The Voynich manuscript isn't going anywhere. It will sit in its library, outlasting all of us, still mysterious, still carefully made, still impossible to read, still offering that strange combination of accessibility and inscrutability that has made it fascinating to so many people for so long, still keeping its secrets, if it has any, still looking like meaning even if it contains none, still waiting, patient and silent, the way books do for someone who might understand, or not. Sleep well. Dream of impossible plants growing in forgotten gardens, of stars arranged in patterns that don't match the sky, of symbols that flow like language across pages of 600-year-old vellum. Dream of a mystery that persists not because it's hidden, but because it exists in a shape we haven't learned to recognize. The manuscript will still be there in the morning, exactly as mysterious as it's been all along. And that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be.